Hi, how are you doing? I hope you're doing all right. So, today I'm going to read 3 stories about the bunnies. I hope you're going to enjoy them, and I will try to read in soft voice so you just can enjoy those beautiful stories. So, the first one which I'm going to read is going to be The Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies. So, it is said that the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. I have never felt sleepy after eating lettuces, but then I'm not a rabbit. They certainly had very soporific effect upon the Flopsy bunnies. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a large family, and they were very improvident and cheerful. I do not remember the separate names of their children. They were generally called the Flopsy bunnies. As there was not always quite enough to eat, Benjamin used to borrow cabbages from Flopsy's brother, Peter Rabbit, who kept a nursery garden. Sometimes Peter Rabbit had no cabbage to spare. When this happened, the Flopsy bunnies went across the field to a rubbish heap in a ditch outside Mr. McGregor's garden. Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap was a mixture. There were jam pots and paper bags and mountains of chopped grass from mowing machine, which always tasted oily, and some rotten vegetable marrows and an old boot or two. One day, oh joy, there were quantity of overrun lettuces, which had shot into flower. The Flopsy bunnies were stuffed lettuces. By degrees, one after another, we were overcome with slumber and lay down in mown grass. Benjamin was not so much overcome as his children. Before going to sleep, he was sufficiently wide awake to put the paper bag over his head to keep off the flies. This little Flopsy bunny slept delightfully in the warm sun. From the lawn beyond the garden came the distant clackety sound of the mowing machine. The blue bottles buzzed about the wall, and the little old mouse picked over the rubbish among the jam pots. I can tell you her name. She was called Thomasina Tittlemaus, a wood mouse with a long tail. She rustled across the paper bag and awakened Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologized profusely and said that she knew Peter Rabbit. While she and Benjamin were talking, close under the wall, they heard a heavy tread above their heads, and suddenly Mr. McGregor emptied out a sackful of lawn mowings right upon the top of the sleeping Flopsy bunnies. Benjamin shrunk down under his paper bag. The mouse hid in jam pot. The little rabbits smiled sweetly in their sleep under the shower of grass. They did not awake because of the lettuces had been so soporific. They dreamt that their mother Flopsy was tucking them in the hay bed. Mr. McGregor looked down after emptying his sack. He saw some funny little brown tip of ears sticking up through the lawn mowings. He stared at them for some time. Presently a fly settled down on one of them and moved. Mr. McGregor climbed down on the rubbish heap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said as he dropped them into his sack. The Flopsy bunnies dreamt that their mother was turning them over in bed. They stirred a little in their sleep, but they still did not wake up. Mr. McGregor tied up the sack and left it on the wall. He went to put away the mowing machine. While he was gone, Mrs. Flopsy Bunny, who had remained at home, came across the field. She looked suspiciously at the sack and wondered where everybody was. Then the mouse came out the jam pot, and Benjamin took the paper bag off his head, and then they told the doleful tale. Benjamin and Flopsy were in despair. They could not undo the string, but Mrs. Tittlemaus was a resourceful person. She nibbled a hole in the bottom corner of the sack. The little rabbits were pulled out and pinched them to wake them. Their parents stuffed the empty sack with the rotten vegetable marrows, an old black brush, and 2 decayed turnips. Then they all hid under the bush and watched for Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor came back and picked up the sack, carried it off. He carried it in hanging down as if it were rather heavy. The Flopsy bunnies followed at a safe distance. They watched him go into his house, and then they crept up to the window and listened. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have been extremely painful to the Flopsy bunnies if they had happened to have been inside it. They could hear drag his chair on the flags and chuckle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said Mr. McGregor. What's that? Where have been spoiling on? Inquired Mrs. McGregor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little fat rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. 1, 2, 3. Don't you be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, replied Mr. McGregor. The youngest Flopsy bunny got up on the window all. Mrs. McGregor took hold of the sack and felt it. She said she could feel 6, but they must be old rabbits, because they were so hard and all different shapes. Not fit to eat, but the skins will do fine to line my cold cloak. Line your cold cloak? Shouted Mr. McGregor. I shall sell them and buy myself baccy. Rabbit tobacco. I shall skin them and cut off their heads. Mrs. McGregor untied the sack and put her hand inside. When she felt vegetable, she became very, very angry. She said that Mr. McGregor had done it on purpose. And Mr. McGregor was very angry too. One of the rotten marrows came flying through the kitchen window and hit the youngest Flopsy bunny. It was rather hurt. Then Benjamin and Flopsy thought it was the time to go home. So Mr. McGregor did not get his tobacco, and Mr. McGregor did not get her rabbit skins. But next Christmas, Thomasina Tittlemouse got a present of enough rabbit wool to make her a cloak and a hood and a handsome muff and a pair of warm mittens. So the second tale I'm going to read, it's going to be the tale of Benjamin Bunny. For the children of Southbury from old Mr. Bunny. One morning a little rabbit sat on the bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off with a hop, skin, and a jump to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffatees. I once bought a pair at the bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea, and the rabbit tobacco, which was what we call lavender. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round at the back of the third tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked poorly and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. Peter, said little Benjamin in a whisper, who has gotten your clothes? Peter replied, Miss Scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden, and described how he had been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and the coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousins and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped that it would rain. At this point, old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard inside the rabbit hole calling, Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more chamomile. Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand, and got upon the flat top of the wall and the bottom of the wood. From there they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with the old tam o' shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said, "It spoils people's clothes to squeeze under the gate. The proper way is to climb down a pear tree." Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with lettuces. We left a great many old little footmarks all over the bed, especially that little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. We took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night. There was water in the shoes, and the coat was somehow shrunk. Benjamin tried on a tam o' shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter didn't seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home, and ate lettuce leaf. He said he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get the lettuces for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half of the onions. Little Benjamin said that it was possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly towards our end of the garden. We went along a little walk on planks, under the sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on their doorstep, cracking cherry stones. We winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently Peter let the pocket handkerchief go again. We got amongst flower pots and the frames and the tubes. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousins when he suddenly stopped. This is what those little rabbits saw around the corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then in half of the minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself, and came and sniffed in the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw a picture of Peter Benjamin underneath the basket, because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall at the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall on the top of the cat and cuffed it off the basket and kicked it to the greenhouse, scratching a handful for. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with a little switch. Then he took his nephew Peter. Then he took the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. Then Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later. He observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he couldn't understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and a coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. Okay, now let's read the third tale. These amazing tales. So, the tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank, underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were a good little bunnies, went down from the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of Cucumber Frame, whom shouldn't he meet but Mr. McGregor's? Mr. McGregor's was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he hadn't unfortunately run into Gooseberry Net and got caught by the large buttons of his jacket. It was blue jacket with the brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop on the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it hadn't had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in a tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath the flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently Peter sneezed, "Kertyshoo!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of the window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he hadn't not least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in the can. After a time he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in a wood. Peter asked her the way to gate, but she had large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently he came to the pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still, but now and then the tip of her tail twitched if it were alive. Peter thought it best it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about the cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard a noise of a horse scritch, scratch, scratch, scritch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon the wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor's hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could along a straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught a sight of him the corner, but Peter didn't care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe in the last wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket on the shoes for the scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired when he flopped down upon the nice soft and on the floor of his rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what she had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I'm sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed, and he made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter, 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had the bread and milk and the blackberries for supper. The end. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy these stories. And I wish you to relax and to enjoy and just enjoy these beautiful stories. Thank you. Goodbye.